In a recent conversation that caught even devoted fans off guard, Mark Lowry said something about Guy Penrod that nobody in the gospel community had heard him say in 50 years of public life. And the response from people who have loved both men for decades has been anything but settled. What made the moment land so differently from the usual homecoming banter was that Mark wasn't performing when he said it. He wasn't working the room. He was being still, which anyone who has watched him for 5 decades knows is not his natural setting. And in that stillness, he admitted something about his years alongside Guy Penrod that reframes everything fans thought they understood about that chapter of the Gaither Vocal Band. Some longtime followers are calling this the most honest thing Mark has said in a public setting in years, while others believe it should have stayed private. By the time this video reaches the 10-minute mark, you will have heard all of it, and you'll understand exactly why this admission has started a conversation inside the gospel community that shows no sign of slowing down. Mark Lowry joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 1988, and from his very first appearance on those homecoming videos, audiences understood they were watching someone who operated by a completely different set of rules than everyone else on that stage. While other men stood tall and sang with formal reverence, Mark sat sideways in his chair, told jokes that always seemed to circle back to grace, and made 5,000 people at a time feel like church could be something other than dignified at every single moment. He was the disruptor who never disrupted the spirit of the room, and that combination made him genuinely irreplaceable inside the Gaither world. What most people associate with Mark, even those who couldn't name a single song he recorded, is the lyric he wrote in 1984, a poem that started as a writing assignment he gave himself as a young man from Houston, Texas, wondering what Mary might have felt holding the infant Jesus in her arms. Mary, Did You Know? Became one of the most recorded songs in Christian music history, covered by artists across every genre, played at funerals and baptisms and hospital bedsides across the world for more than 40 years. That lyric came from a comedian who couldn't sit still in church, and there is a whole theology contained in that fact alone. Before any of the complicated feelings about Guy Penrod entered the picture, Mark's years inside the Gaither family were among the most joyful chapters in Southern gospel music. Bill Gaither began producing the homecoming videos in 1991, and those recordings gave Mark a platform unlike anything he could have built on his own. He was surrounded by artists who had defined sacred music for a generation, people whose names belonged on any short list of Christian music history. And rather than being swallowed by that company, Mark became the emotional counterbalance to all that grandeur. He made audiences feel like they were allowed to enjoy themselves in the presence of the holy, and that permission was something people responded to with something close to devotion. For millions of fans who passed those homecoming videos around their church congregations on VHS, Mark wasn't just a performer. He was the feeling you got when you realized that faith didn't have to be heavy every single minute of every day. And then, in 1994, Guy Penrod joined the Gaither Vocal Band, and everything in that room shifted. Guy arrived carrying everything an audience could want. The voice came first, a tenor with the kind of range and warmth that makes other trained singers go quiet in genuine respect. The presence came second, because Guy Penrod walking onto a stage has always been the kind of entrance that reorders a room without effort or announcement. And then there was the quality that Mark himself has referenced more than once across the years, that still, commanding physical bearing, the flowing hair, the way Guy could stand at a microphone and make 5,000 people feel that something holy was approaching before he'd sung a single note. When Guy performed Feeling at Home in the Presence of Jesus in front of a homecoming crowd for the first time, people were weeping before the first verse was finished. Mark watched all of this happen from a few feet away, on the same stage, in the same chair, telling the same jokes and carrying the same warmth he had always carried. And for years, Every interview Mark gave suggested that the relationship between the two men was exactly what it appeared to be on those recordings. Two brothers in the Christian faith, one making people laugh and one making people weep, and between them, covering the full range of what a human heart needs from gospel music. But there was a layer of that story Mark had never fully addressed, not the way he addressed it recently. And what he said when he finally got there puts a different kind of light on everything that came before it. And that difference is the heart of what you're watching right now. Most people who have watched Mark over the years are familiar with the hair jokes, the bits about standing next to someone that movie star handsome, the affectionate comedy he and Guy generated together on stage across 14 years in that group. What Mark steered away from, in every version of that story he told publicly before this one, was the feeling underneath the joke. And the feeling underneath the joke turns out to be what this story is actually about. Mark has spoken at various points about the particular pressure of performing comedy alongside one of the greatest gospel voices of the past 30 years. When you are the funny one in a group, and the man standing 3 feet from you can bring an arena to complete silence with a single held note, you learn something about yourself fairly quickly. You learn whether your own contribution carries its own weight, or whether you've been quietly telling yourself a story about your significance that the audience's reaction doesn't always confirm. Learning that in real time, on camera, in front of the gospel community, is not a comfortable experience by any measure. What Mark admitted in this recent conversation, one that has since circulated through gospel media and among fans who have followed both men for decades, is that there were years inside the Gaither Vocal Band when watching Guy receive that particular kind of reverence stirred something in him that he didn't understand at the time and wasn't comfortable naming. He described it not as jealousy exactly, because the word jealousy doesn't quite capture what he was reaching for, but as a kind of grief for the part of himself that wanted to move people the way a great voice moves people, knowing that comedy, no matter how brilliantly delivered, arrives in the body differently than a song does. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle anticipated, because Mark didn't stop there. He went further than anyone expected, further than gospel media was prepared for. And what came next is the precise reason this conversation has divided people who have loved both him and Guy Penrod. Mark said that when Guy departed the Gaither Vocal Band in 2008 to pursue his solo career, his first feeling was not the sadness that most of the group expressed publicly at the time. His first feeling, the one that arrived before anything else could settle in, was relief. Not relief that Guy was gone, and Mark drew that line carefully, but relief that the particular weight of standing alongside that level of talent night after night was finally lifting off him. And then, almost immediately, he said, the shame moved in right behind the relief, because Guy Penrod had never been anything other than a genuine friend, a man of real and consistent Christian faith, a brother who treated Mark with respect and warmth across every season they shared on that stage. The shame, Mark said, taught him more than the relief ever could. What the shame showed him was that he had spent years measuring himself against someone who wasn't competing with him at all. Guy wasn't trying to outshine anyone. Guy was simply being Guy, going out every night and doing what God built him to do. And everything Mark had carried in response to that was something he needed to work through between himself and God, not between himself and Guy. What struck the fans who heard this was the precision of it. Mark wasn't speaking in generalities about contentment or the spiritual life as an abstract idea. He was naming a specific feeling from a specific chapter of his life and saying directly that the feeling was unflattering and that he had carried it for longer than he wanted to admit out loud. Many longtime followers responded with something close to gratitude. Fans who have followed both men for the better part of 30 years called this the most honest window into the behind-the-scenes reality of the Gaither world that any insider had ever opened, not as gossip, but as testimony. The argument was that Mark's willingness to name a complicated interior experience and trace it honestly back to his own unmet longing was exactly the kind of spiritual truth the church has always needed more of, and usually receives less of from the people standing in the spotlight. Others were considerably less comfortable with what they heard. A portion of the gospel community felt that making this public, even framed with grace and hindsight, cast an unflattering shadow over Guy Penrod, without giving Guy any say in how the story was told. Several fans noted that Guy had not responded publicly, and they felt that Mark's honesty, however genuine in intention, had made Guy a supporting character in a narrative about Mark's own interior journey without Guy's participation or knowledge of what was coming. Guy Penrod, for his part, has long been known inside the gospel community as a man who keeps his own counsel. His exit from the Gaither Vocal Band in 2008 was handled with a dignity that people across the industry remarked on at the time, and in the years since, building a substantial solo career in Christian and country gospel music, Guy has spoken about the Gaither years with consistent warmth and zero score settling. Nothing in his public record suggests he experienced those years through anything like the complicated lens Mark has now described. And that asymmetry is a significant part of what makes this admission so difficult to hold comfortably. The faith dimension of all this matters deeply to the people who have followed these artists, and this audience understands that better than most outside observers ever could. The feelings Mark described are not unusual ones. They are the kind of feelings that have appeared in the spiritual writing of centuries, the invisible hierarchies that form even inside communities built explicitly on love and mutual encouragement, the way comparison operates even in the most sacred spaces, the long and sometimes painful work of learning to receive your own calling without measuring it constantly against the calling God gave someone else. What is unusual is saying it out loud, with your name attached, about a specific living person who was your colleague for 14 years. For those who have followed Mark Lowry's journey across every chapter of it, from the early comedy albums to the homecoming stages to the quieter years after his time with the Gaither Vocal Band wound down, this admission arrives as something earned. Mark has spent his public life being honest about the gap between who he wants to be and who he sometimes is. He has talked openly about his ADHD diagnosis and what it meant to grow up feeling like someone who didn't fit the shape the world expected of him. He has never performed a version of himself that was tidier or more composed than the truth. This admission is consistent with all of that. It's the next layer down, and the next layer is always the one that costs the most to say. What this tells us in the larger story of gospel music is harder to summarize quickly, because it asks the listener to hold two things at once. Mark Lowry gave the Gaither Vocal Band something irreplaceable across the decades he spent there, and he was also a human being working through real limitations in real time while he was doing it. Those two facts don't cancel each other out. They complete each other. And the people who have spent the most time inside the church know exactly what that looks like when they see it. Those of you who have followed Mark since the early homecoming days know what it means to watch someone lead with their wounds rather than with their trophies. And you know that the ones who do that are usually the ones who have earned the right to be heard. Mark earned this honesty across a very long time, and however people feel about whether it belonged in a public setting, the fact that he could name it, sit with the shame of it, and still speak about Guy Penrod with nothing but respect is its own kind of testimony. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't fully connected yet, and it has to do with what the Gaither Vocal Band's particular environment has always asked of the people inside it. Bill Gaither built something in Christian music that has no real parallel. A community of artists who performed together across decades, whose personal faith journeys became woven into the very content they were producing together, whose private struggles eventually found their way into the songs and into the room in ways that no other gospel ensemble has ever quite replicated. The homecoming model was never simply entertainment. It was ministry as testimony, and testimony as performance, which meant the distance between the private life and the public one was always thinner inside the Gaither world than it was anywhere else in sacred music. For Mark, that thinness has been both gift and burden across his entire career. Bill recognized early that Mark's comedy was most powerful when it came from somewhere real, from actual pain worn lightly rather than from manufactured cheerfulness. And he gave Mark the room, over and over again, to be that honest on stage. What that arrangement also meant was that Mark's interior life was always closer to the surface than it would have been in a more formal setting, and the feelings he's now describing about those years beside Guy Penrod were almost certainly present in the room every time the cameras rolled, even when nobody watching could have named what they were seeing. Michael English, who lived through his own complicated chapter inside the Gaither family during the 1990s, has spoken in recent years about how much the homecoming environment asked of its participants emotionally, and his reflections land close to what Mark is now describing. That being inside something that beautiful and that exposed at the same time is not a simple experience, and that the feelings it generates are not always the ones you'd choose if you had the choice beforehand. What Bill Gaither has produced over more than 50 years in Southern gospel and Christian music is a body of work that keeps returning to the same question from different angles. What does it mean to be a person of genuine faith in the middle of an ordinary, complicated, and often humbling human life? Mark Lowry's recent honesty about Guy Penrod is just the latest answer to that question from inside that world, and it sounds exactly like something that belongs in the Gaither catalog, right alongside everything else the family has ever produced. What happens next for Mark Lowry, and whether his honesty opens a longer conversation with Guy Penrod, or simply stands as one man's private reckoning made public, is something the gospel community will be watching closely. Mark is at a point in his life where the comedy is still present, but shares more space than it once did with something quieter, something that sounds less like performance and more like a man making peace with his own story. Whether Guy responds publicly, and whether the two men address this together in any formal setting, remains an open question that fans have already begun asking in every corner of the gospel music world. Whatever comes next, those who have followed this ministry for decades know one thing: Mark Lowry's story isn't finished, and neither is the conversation his honesty started this time. If this story stayed with you, the next video will as well. We've been following the untold chapters inside the Gaither Vocal Band's long history, and what came out of that research is just as layered and just as unexpected as what you heard here today.